Great. Thank you all for joining in. And we're very happy that you're here and you're here to join us for our presentation by Neha Mungekar. And so I would like to, I'm Vishali Joshi and I'm your host for this session today. And so I would like to walk you through the agenda for today. So I'll be introducing briefly about Vastukul, the organization that has conducted this webinar, and also introduce Neha, who's our speaker today. And then after that, Neha will give a presentation, and after that, we have an opportunity for the participants to ask question and answer from Neha. And also, while Neha is giving her presentation, I invite everybody to type their questions, comments, or any doubts that they have in the chat box. So then I would like to go ahead and talk about Vastukul. So Vastukul is an online educational platform for architecture, design, and planning education. Yes, so the focus is on giving mentorship and online educational courses. So Vastukul offers educational courses and mentorship sessions by the global leaders, and the focus is on more practical skills and experiential learning when it comes to architecture, design, and planning education. So I'm sure that many of you during your years at the school would have experienced a variety of issues related to education, such as the rising educational costs, the student debt, and also the lack of practical skills in the curriculum. At the same time, we are not allowed to customize the subjects as per our needs as we grow in the classroom structure. And there is also lack of professional outreach that we experience as a student and as professional. At the same time, there is lack of mentorship that a lot of us experience. So overall, I would say lack of quality education. So Vastu provide a lot of services to tackle these different issues. For example, Vastukul provides live and pre-recorded online courses, mentorship programs. It also provides innovation and research lab. At the same time, it also hosts live webinars and workshops such as this one. And the idea is to engage in experiential learning and visual thinking. And there are other customized course subscriptions that will come in future. And so we have been conducting a lot of webinars and workshops and events. So this was one of our last webinar, which was about women leaders, where a lot of speakers from across multiple countries, they gave their journey, they gave a career talk about where they are now and how they came into this field in which they are working. And about 100 people from all over different countries, from all over the world, they joined this webinar. And this time today we have with us Neha. Neha is an action researcher and who's working in water management and governance. She is pursuing her PhD from the Netherlands, and her project is based in India. And with Neha today, Neha will be discussing a lot of different questions, such as what are the newer avenues for architects, designers, and urban designers, and how do you, as in the position of architect and urban designer, engage with people, and what are the additional capacities that are required for urban designers to work on facilitation and knowledge brokering, and how can you practice and conduct academic research at the same time, and how do researchers work on ground, and do you think governance system works? So with all these bunch of questions, Neha will walk us through her career experience, and she will share her journey with us. So welcome, Neha, and I invite you to share your screen and start your presentation.
Thanks, Vaishali, for this very generous introduction. Let me just share. So thank you, everyone. So I am Neha, and Vaishali, as she provided an introduction of me, I would also like to take you through my journey at the start, and then maybe explain you what I did, why I did things. So just to start with, like many of us, after immediately my HSC, I studied in the state board. I took science as my background. I had a very linear way of thinking and did the most normal things ever, what my parents told. And then when I joined architecture, it actually opened my horizon. I started to think there are so many different ways you can think and do. And also, like, there is no absolute answer. There is subjectivity in the way we do things. It's not always the correct or the right solution. It is the solution that you think can be fine. With this kind of things, it actually opened a host of other things that I could do. And with that, I immediately pursued my first master's in urban design in CEPT Ahmedabad. And one of the biggest shift I felt was during my 5 years training as an architect. I had become that person of me person, like me, my design, my concept. It was all about me and putting me outside on an object, and that completely changed when I started to pursue this masters. Urban design is all about being invisible, being a facilitator, acknowledging the problem of the masses and putting them before you. And more than learning, it was more of an unlearning experience for me. And for me personally, it was a huge step up in my personality of who I was and what I became. And after my urban design masters, I worked with WRI as an urban management facilitator. So my job would be to facilitate projects. So in architecture and urban design or planning, we learn to make a project. So immediately when we are even passing from those kind of institutions, we start feeling, oh, from a building, we will now make a city. But no, you don't make a city. There are 100 people, there are different stakeholders who have different ways of tackling. And my role was to mediate amongst those different ideas, among these different roles and different capacities. And therefore, my role became more and more invisible, and I was quite comfortable with that in my skin. And while doing that, so though this role was very important, I felt it was very difficult for me to explain it to my peers, to my family, to even friends. And then I started to write a lot about why this role is important. And at that time, I also started to do a bit of photojournalism, because there were so many aspects I felt that are not understood. Like, for example, even understanding how to answer a problem. Sometimes it's not the answer, but the way you frame a problem is also a step one of a solution. So these kind of things, whatever I used to think, I used to write, and that's how the journey of photojournalism began. And with that, I used to also teach on weekends or on certain days. And with that, I used to have one leg in academia, and in my work in WRI, one leg in practice. So these three things took me for 6 7 years. And later, I started to realize I'm becoming more of a generalist and a transport person, because I used to work on enabling pedestrianized solution. And I wanted to move in water sector, but in a similar domain of facilitator. And hence, I decided to study a second master's in water governance and management. And from that, I started to work in this project called Water for Change with Government of India as a PhD researcher. So if you see, like, these steps are not separate. Like, when I did architecture, urban design was very much a part of it. But as I said, I had to unlearn many of these things. And with my work of facilitation, it was also an offshoot from urban design. Many people do different things from these. Like, some people also do restoration, some people also do architecture teaching and more of academia. So my work was to work as an enabler, and teaching, it brought to me a fresh perspective of what's happening in different circles, how are they thinking, what are the different ways of even learning different experiences. And with that, then I moved to water governance sector in both academia and practice. And so I saw water not being in my recent life, but also, like, I used to deal with water questions from architecture and also in urban design. Like, my thesis in both the aspects were based on water in both my studies. And also photojournalism played a huge role, because it helped me to convey what I was saying. Because when we study in one institute and we stay with one kind of people, we start talking a certain language. We think it's simpler, like, but even like for my parents to understand what is the plan, like, this word was very difficult. So things like that, we start taking it for granted. And photojournalism helped me realize that there are certain topics, there are certain codes, certain words that are difficult to understand. There are certain values that are difficult to understand, and that kept helped me to be real in that way in what I was doing. So from here, I will start this presentation from architect to enabler, and I have divided my presentation in four parts. I will start with my spatial journey, and then how I started to work as a knowledge broker, and then my work in water governance and this project. So yeah, as a typical portrait of an architect, I was someone who was very much working on paper, on a drawing board with plans and how things should look like. So as an urban designer, I was working on public spaces, street designs, and also how do I make the DCR more people centric, how can the codes be made more inclusive. So this is what I also learned in my school in urban design. But however, like this journey from the first drawing board to this was very long, because I worked on enabling this way to co-own these things. So to give you an example, in one of my projects at WRI, I was working on pedestrianizing a public space in Manik Chowk, Ahmedabad. This looks very correct and right as an urban designer who has been taught in a by a set of people who believe in these values. But as a user, the needs are quite different. Sometimes it also happens that they believe in these values but do not want to do it. Like pedestrianization and cars are bad, carbon emissions are happening. Yes, we all believe in it, we all know it. But then how many of us really want to let go of a car or a parking space? No one. They're like, yeah, you can pedestrianize, but in my neighbor's a street, not in front of my house. So you have this kind of armchair activism happening in our country. So in that space, then the idea is not to design, but to have this sense of ownership to this concept itself, and that became my step one. And to make this possible, to enable the ideas, I started to work on different processes. So my problem here was not to find the solution to a spatial problem, but to find the way to accept this, to co-own this. And there are many ways to do it. So one of the first ways was, how do you have the stakeholder or the government first to accept this idea, right? Because sometimes we study this in fancy colleges and academia, but then the practitioners, the engineers in the municipality feel like, you know what, this happens in West countries, it doesn't happen in India. So how do you make them realize that no, it can happen, and also you can appropriate that? And to do this, we started to work with something called as facilitation workshops. So this we did in Naya Raipur, the new capital city of Chhattisgarh. In the left bottom picture, you see there are two kinds of people. On the right, you see these old men. On the left, you see are the younger people. So this is exactly what we did. We got good architecture students from the local college, local universities, who worked on transit-oriented development principles. So they knew the principles, they knew the correct or the principles that to make a city pedestrianized. And then on the right, we had developers, we had Ministry of Urban Housing, we had development authority people who knew how things happen, who knew how codes are understood. The developer knows what people really want. We have this idea of having this inclusive building that will have all lower income, middle income, and higher income staying together. But then, do people really want to stay in a house building like that? They want to stay in a building with the same class. That is actually what demand is, and we cannot force this. So these are the two things where, as a designer, as a facilitator, you have to balance between needs and demands. And if not, how do you nudge this? How do you? So then, what we did is we created this design share, where we made these groups of a practitioner and a designer and academic, and asked them to work together and come up with a solution. In this, what happened? The students, they came to know the real on ground issues, and the architects and the builders, they started to think out of the box solutions of what could be done. Maybe you can have the same building but different entrances, so people don't even know that in that building there are people staying of different classes and castes, like these kind of solutions. So this is something that we worked on. So what was my role? My role was to broker and create this platform where these exchanges could happen. I do not own the designs, but I own the process by which they can exchange and foster a solution. Similarly, in another situation in Ahmedabad, and also in Bombay, we were working on making footpaths an accessible space. Like in India, footpaths are only meant for, say, street hawking, and there's no actual space to walk. There is always encroachment on the footpath, or they're broken, or there are scooters parked on it. So when we say we need more footpaths, then an engineer from that municipality will show a map saying, "Listen, we have space for footpath." However, an encroached footpath is not a footpath, right? it becomes a parking lot. So to create this kind of awareness again, we actually designed a walk with all the officials. And for that, it took us a lot of months to convince and say, listen, like to get those high profile people on the road, we also had to get like security. And then we started walking with a timer and said, the number of times you step down from the footpath is and we'll count that, and then we'll see how many times you step down and how many times you are just walking straight. And then how much time do you wait at the signal? And with that, everyone realized that the parking, the walking conditions are really really bad. And if that gets resolved first, then the traffic conditions will get resolved first. And this is what we did. So our problem here, what we identified was, again, not the space but the awareness. You tackle the awareness, you make people own the problem, and then the space design will happen. So that was something. And on the right, you see end of it. Like the first step was just like completing us, and on the second picture, you see what happened 6 years later, where we had all different kinds of people on the same temple. We call it consensus building, where the consensus was built. And in the next picture, I will show what were the different issues when it came to working with different people. So again, even if we got like a kind of a yes, a kind of a positive nod from the engineers, did not mean they would agree on our solutions. So in that, again, it was not my role to go and present the design. You find a person in the municipality or in a system or whoever where you're working, we call it champion, who believes in you, who believes in the idea of working on this project. You tell him or her, and that person takes the design ahead. And that is what we did. So in our design, the deputy commissioner, who was a tourism and a culture commissioner, his interest was in history. So he believed in that design, and it was his personal motivation that to take this idea ahead and get the UNESCO World Heritage tag to Ahmedabad. And we just like piggybacked on his enthusiasm and worked on it. And that's what happened. And he's the one who persuaded the commissioners and got all the engineers together. He actually built that alignment with different people, different officers, and also users. And that's how the plan moved ahead. So this was something how we worked with the bureaucratic challenges in the formal system. However, in the user side, it was again more complex. When we say community or neighborhood, does not mean everyone is the same. Everyone has their own vested interest. Everyone has their own politics. So in that, again, for me, as a Bombay person going to Ahmedabad and telling this is what needs to be done, it was wrong. It was completely wrong. I was not even a native of that area. So who am I to tell them what is right or wrong? So what we did is we found a gynecologist, a doctor who was well traveled, and also someone who was like well connected to the commissioner and also. So what happens is in our culture, a gynac is the most trusted doctor in our Indian families. Like a women's doctor, women's issues. So, and he was a Gujarati speaking local doctor. So he believed in this idea, and he's like, I will present it in one of the houses. So we started to, visit people's houses and we started presenting, but it wasn't me. It was him. On the right, you see the gynac presenting the design, saying, listen, I have been to Venice, and Venice was a beautiful experience because the cars were parked 5 minutes from your house, and 5 minutes walking is not a big deal. And because of that, the space became amazing and tourists started coming. And it will actually increase our property value. So the way he started to explain was very different from way I explained. I was explaining using urban design principles, and he was actually also explaining like as a citizen, as a proud citizen, and how the quotient of this area will go up. And that was something really catching, and people believed him. It was he vouching for this idea, and that's how that design went ahead, and it created a sense of ownership amongst the users. And then it became a demand driven, then the people wanted to make this happen, and that's how the design was done. So if you ask me the time, it took me 3 months on the drawing table to make the design, and with a lot of changes, of course, but it took 6 months for people to own it, and then the process went very smooth. Another thing is many times as an architect also working on redevelopment projects or neighborhood designs, you have people who have different not, I won't say vested interest, but different issues. And it's very human to say my issues are more important than yours. And here I see the problem again not being of the space but of empathy. And then how do you tackle empathy as a designer? So here this was not something I worked mainly. I was helping one of my colleague in my office. So this was a board game and also a card game that we designed, where we started to do role plays, and this also had children, women, old people, and also people who do not speak the same language, because all of us use this space, right? I mean, you can talk in any languages. So basically, you have to imagine if you are staying in this neighborhood, what would be the problem, and therefore, so it just made people, put themselves in other people's shoes and think what could be, and then retrospect and reflect: is your problem really that big? How does it happen when you become a child? How does it happen when as a if you're coming as a working woman at night? And then do you think, is your problem a bigger problem? So these kind of things, and in this, two things happen. One is retrospection and reflection on your own problems, and B, people started to know who are in the neighborhoods in first place. It, these board games were played like on Saturdays or Sundays in a neighborhood, and that it also increased a lot of face value. Like, people didn't even know these kind of people are also staying in the same neighborhood. So it became a kind of a meeting platform, and that also kind of increased the empathy amongst the people. And they were like, oh, you're coming here every time, so you have an interest. So so buddies started to happen. And that also helped in designing this neighborhood from a collective way. Again, our role was not to design. Our role was to create empathy, a sense of kinship, friendship in among those neighbors and the people staying in the neighborhood, and then come up with a collective design. So here again, the job was to facilitate that design. So these are some of the things that I used to work on through these means to enable a more democratic solution. And it required a lot of patience to come up to this. Again, so while doing that, I used to work on a lot of outreach things. Like I do photojournalism. I started to even, that's where I started to work on real hardcore physical water and environmental issues. Something like, like there is a river interlinking. We have this idea of, sending water from point A to point B, and it could be like 500 kilometers away. But then what happens? How do you sense water? So on the left, there was a story that I published in Down to Earth in Uzbekistan, how the water actually becomes saline when you do these kind of things. I also started to, I just went beyond my normal domain. And this story was on health workers, water pollution, and also like I started mixing domains as well. Like, this story was on environmental bans are important for mining, but then how it affects livelihood, like social science and environmental science coming together. And when these domains come together, you have really interesting inquiries, and that actually is where the problem arises. We have this tendency of looking at problems through only one lens, and but the like that's where we diagnose the problem wrong, and then the solutions do not work. And that's what this process helped me understand. So maybe, I'm not a person, I won't be always right in framing my problem. I need different perspectives to frame a problem. So my role is actually of a facilitator, and that also made me remain humble in my approach. And with this development of my personality, I decided to take a next step, and I decided to pursue a second master's at the age of 32. So this was quite weird in Indian scenario as a woman, like leaving everything and going and doing a master's. And at this time, even getting scholarships are difficult because it has an age limit as well. So yeah, with all those barriers, crossing all those barriers, I started this. And it was quite tricky as well, because over these years of like 6-7 years of practice and studying architecture, I had to study these kind of subjects, which also included, say, how do I do diplomacy? Like, how do two ambassadors, like, they speak in terms of negotiations? Then also things like chemistry, physics. I had to study all those things to understand exactly how water governance work. And when I talk of water governance, I would, like, explain some myths before. Water management and governance is not gardening. I have always felt this in my entire career. When I talk about my work, everyone has an opinion, and it feels very weird that, with the conviction people say by their experience, it's like water science is something that was taught to us in grade 2 or 3. No, it's not like that. It's not water falling from the clouds falls on the ground and meets the sea. Like, the first thing that was taught to me was this hydrological cycle itself is a myth. It's not hydrological cycle, it's actually hydrosocial cycle. Water that falls on the ground, it's been stopped using walls. The powerful countries and the powerful people decide where the water will go, and therefore it's not the cycle after all. It's actually completely manipulated, and with that complications you have to work now. um, so some more mythbusters is governance is not government. Government is one of the stakeholder. Governance is how you work with different stakeholders. So there's more than government in governance. Governance is not policy. Policy is a tool to do things. It's set of regulations. There's a framework how to conduct certain things, and that's policy. Governance is not that, and governance is not it's not management either. So when we say management, it means like if there is you have a tank full of some certain liters of water, and you have to distribute that water among 100 people. So how you distribute it? You take a calculator or an Excel sheet and you divide by number of people and you distribute evenly. That becomes a management exercise. But in that, if you decide to divide it equitably, if people are living on a slope, so you decide to send water using a pump, so more water towards someone staying below, and higher water. So these decisions, they're coming by certain knowledge, coming by certain values. Someone calling you to make that decision, like pressurizing you. So there are this political side to it as well. All these things is governance. So governance means practice of coordination and decision making between different actors around contested resource distributions. And when I say distributions, it does not only mean the material water, it also means voice and authority, and also knowledge and expertise. With what knowledge do you make this decision? Do you want to share it equitably? Do you want to share the water based on certain caste, religion, whatever? And who is the one deciding? Who has this authority to decide? All these things matter, and that is what is governance. Interestingly, this is, if you do not get the governance right, your brilliant solutions, your brilliant technology will not pass through. And that is also something that I see one of the big problems in our country. We have focused a lot on engineering solutions. Our first prime minister actually said dams are temples of the nation. I choose to not believe in this anymore. Our country has the highest concentration of dams, but we have also the highest concentration of water problems, and we have all kinds of water problems: pollution, scarcity, and also flooding. So it's not the technical solutions. It's about how do you facilitate solutions, right? And that is what governance has become to. And interestingly, the people who resolve are not engineers. So my background is not an engineer, and unfortunately, even if the problem is diagnosed well, you get wrong doctors. It's that kind of a thing, and that is what is happening, especially in our country, to resolve water issues. So with this in mind, with this kind of study, my earlier work during my master's was in gender and water. So I used to see how water access is different for men, women, and children. And when the access is different, the issues are faced differently. And when issues are faced differently, and on top of it, there are different agencies of people to talk, right? If water issues are generally women issues, like women are the one who are working mostly in the kitchen, but then the decision makers are all men. So you see the gap. So that is what it is. So the problem is not about asking men to speak. The problem is how do you empower women so they can actually speak about the water issues. And that is what I was working on during my master's. So this was my research and work in Africa, in Zambia. And I saw that, this value of, doing household chores, water collection is too womanly, it's too childlike. So there's who gives these values? Like it's just a job. How do you assign these values? And when you assign these values, how does it affect policy making? And it does a huge impact on it. And that is what I was looking at. So what were these reasons why it was considered trivial? So you see her, like even a 4 year and 5 year child were actually collecting water. And then how do you speak to these children who don't even understand the language? And when you ask questions verbally, then they answer only to that, they only react. So how do you make the respondent proactive in providing experiences? So I worked on drawing competitions where they started saying things like, I work because my parents asked to, so I fear my father, so I have to collect water in spite of there being snakes, and even if they bite, I cannot throw the bucket from my head, because that means I have to wait again in the line, and if I wait in the line, then an old woman comes and she goes ahead, so then I have to again wait longer. So these are some issues which are not even technical. These are how the social fabric functions, and you have to work around it. And that is something I was working. And so one was how are the issues faced differently. And here is this is like a kind of gram panchayat, and the yellow guy on the left is the serpent. Um, and then here there are rules of men and women not sitting and mixing together. I don't remember if you have seen the movie, so there was also something similar. But here the distance is so much that people were not even able to hear the serpent talking. And then how do you think these women are even stating their problems? And then there are men who dismiss those problems. If I had even come across a woman saying that it causes a back issue, but then men are like, so what, everyone faces a back issue, so that's not a problem. But that back issue was so much that it affected her marriage and there were divorces. So it goes in that way, and until you do not even frame it, you do not acknowledge it, you won't solve it. Even something like this, like here you see women, we have 20% women attendance in decision making process, but you see where the paper is and who is signing. So is there, even if there is a physical presence of the women, do we really see participation and voice being enacted in this kind of platforms? So that is something I used to work before. And now from Africa I came to India. And interestingly, I'm just going to end in 5 minutes. So this is a project by Government of India, and they wanted to test this new paradigm called water sensitive city. um, what it looks at is, we have this very centralized way of managing. So you have like this main rivers, and you have certain areas that has less water. So let's transfer this water from point A to point B, which is a very long distance, and that looks like a very physical engineering marvel. And yeah, but that's not a sustainable solution. We have a lot of these very small water bodies, very small rivers, and if we show our dependency on that, the water quality also, you can work on the better water quality, and the water is not lost in that transfer, and the areas will become self sustainable by actually reducing the self dependency on that area. And that is what these paradigms are working on. This is now a change that is happening around the world. From centralized water management, people are working on decentralized, hybrid, polycentric. So there are different versions of it, but it's not completely centralized. But to make this shift possible, you need certain governance processes and structures, and that only that will enable the shift, and that is at the moment not present in our country, and that is something I'm working on in this project. So as I said, the problems of water are not in the water sector, it is beyond, and it's so complex, it is so interconnected and overlapped, that so we call them persistent problems. And to solve these very complex problems, like in my gender research only, my result was how dowry system is affecting access to water. So what is the solution for it, like, and who makes that solution? Is We do not have a social scientist making solution for water, I mean dowry solution. So things like that. So, but then we have very formalized system, we have very formal water centric policies. So these formal policies and systems, they help in certain accountability and vision kind of aspects, but it creates more service provision challenges. And therefore, because of this, we have informality, and therefore we have to perform informality. And when I say informality, and I very much use the word perform because it goes beyond the descriptive use of the term. So I define informality as an organizing logic for both state and non-state actors to make the system work. It is performed through disaggregation. That means different activities that takes place in order to realize the single water service delivery through co-production, and that is expressed through different power dynamics and relations. So therefore, that's to make that system work, what all is required. And that could be, knowing that person from before. It could be knowing, being close to certain power, or being close to certain aspect of this delivery. And with that, because of this, it shows how these system can navigate through these challenges, which are, example, dowry. And therefore it can help in proper delegation. It can also to certain extent address the equity issue also. However, it is still unequal, because in some places it can work, in some places it cannot work. So basically, only informality can also not solve the solution. So in my research, what I'm doing is I'm using the virtue of informality and strengthening that virtue, and also using that virtue to break down its vice. So the positive aspect of the concept I'm strengthening, and the negative aspect I'm reducing it. So that is what I'm working towards governance. So how do you make, through informality, how do I make this system work? So I worked on two capacities of how do people come together, and then by after coming together, how do they solve their issue. So I worked on jugadu, that is an aptitude. I'm not working on jugad, but how do you have that aptitude of finding solutions with whatever is present. So that aptitude is very important, rather than just complaining and whining, saying we do not have money, we do not have resources. Instead, you can come up with solutions with whatever is there. And then which all people are required. So this kind of aptitudes and conditions and capacities is what I'm working on in my research. So at the moment, I have done an individual fieldwork research where I assess if these aptitudes, these capacities, these conditions exist. So in that I speak to people to understand what are the problems they see. And for example, I spoke to a person who was manning the water tank and said, "Oh, no, there are no problems." But then when I started following that person, when I spent a more time with that person, I saw that he is a public figure. He's also a social person. So people come to him coming with their difficulties, like we don't have water for 3 days. Then he's someone who gives water at his own, like actually stepping beyond his mandate, and he gives water. And there's also a water tanker driver who works with him. And the tanker is supposed to empty the entire tank to the designated vendor, like the person who is buying water. However, he would leave certain water, and that amount of water he would be giving to the poor and the needy. So these kind of informality aspects I saw that are trying to bridge those gaps and trying to give water to the people who were not in the formal system of things. So that's how I saw this kind of capacities actually enacting. So this was my role as a scientist, as working as a solo researcher. But as I said, in a collective way of working in transition management, what we do is, so I framed my problems. I thought these are the problems. But then how do you, the first step is, how do you get people believing yes, those are the problems? How do you make them own those issues? So that is something that we did with this first workshop. It's called Collectively Building a Vision. That works with that idea of those six blind men and the elephant. All these blind men start stating problems from their perspective. It's not wrong, but it's not complete either. So when you ask them, what do you think is the problem, and when you start hearing that, you start to imagine the big elephant in the room, and that's how you formulate. And once that problem is built, you start building a vision towards it. And once the vision is built, you start creating pathways. And that's how, and that's how you create solution and upscale it. This method sounds familiar, but it's very different from our normal planning method, where you forecast the steps towards the vision. In transition management, you backcast it. So what happens is, so step one, again, I'm reiterating that. So you have identified actors with different ways of framing the problem. They come from different backgrounds. They have different power relations. So according to them, they think their problem is the greatest. So first you make them sit together on one platform and make them deliberate and come down to consensus. So exactly what you think are the problems. Once that problem is done, we start working on directly the dream. What do you think should be? And when you have the dream, you start stepping back. With the backcasting method. With the backcasting method, what happens is you start making the dream as is reality. You start phasing it, and with that, you start working on, like, to make that step happen, what resources are required. Versus at the moment we work, Like, we are these people who are supposed to make that vision possible. So with our resources, how do you make the vision possible? And therefore, that is the problem why the visions do not get implemented, because the dream is your dream, it's not people's dream. So when you work backwards, so it's a collective dream, and then you have to get people on board. And it could be job beyond architects, and it is job beyond architects and planners. As I said, sometimes the problem is not the space and providing water. Sometimes the problem is creating awareness. So then at that time you need actors and radio people creating jingles and creating this kind of acceptance of a problem. So maybe that can solve half of the issue. And to state that as a problem is something that we do in this stage, and then we start experimenting solutions and see how that design could be reiterated and fine tuned to come down to a final solution. So that is something that I'm working at the moment. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Neha, for sharing your presentation. I feel very energized, and I hope it's the same for our audience here. So I really appreciate you touching upon the aspects that our profession is not isolated. Rather, there are so many interconnections with the systemic and the societal factors out there, and that really defines what really challenges what work we do as urban designers and as architects. So yeah, the floor is open for any questions or comments. So I would invite the audience to ask any questions. You can unmute yourself and just directly ask the question, or you can also type your question in the chat, whatever works for you. Mhm. So I have received a question in a direct chat, and I would put that forward. It's about how can we involve women in decision-making process, and not only physically but actually, and is it a mindset or behavioral change we need to work upon? So I think the question talks more about inclusion in decision making, and how do we make it true participation rather than tokenism in participation.
Yeah, thank you for this question. And personally, in my entire working and experience in participatory ways of management, I feel this participation in decision making is a final step, and we miss out on the first step of education and social learning. And till we do not know the problem, like till we think that's not my problem, designing a city and being in those platforms is not my thing, what do I have? So till I do not feel that I am going to be benefited, or why my voice matters, till then we do not see meaningful participation. So the first step what we do is actually to make people, women, everyone understand how are they even the stakeholder of that project. Till you do not work on that, till people are not aware of their stakes, you won't get the stakeholders talking. That's the thing. So the first step would be to make that project process or whatever output very much relatable to women. How do that project affects women, and then first start talking in smaller groups to individual women, understand their reflections on it, and then they also start realizing, oh, it does affect me, oh, my voice does matter. And then they have this peaked interest in that project, and then they will start following it up. And that is something we should be strengthening more of, oh, there are more people coming, even if they hate the project, that's good, that still shows interest. And that is what you build on. And in that, so you have worked on education, you have worked on social learning, you have worked on creating a community where those women are now, like, even sharing that their opinions, say via WhatsApp or whatever. And then the final step would be to create those platforms where women feel safe, women feel included, and their voice being heard. And that is also something that needs to be worked on. But for me, that comes towards the end. So I would follow these steps to actually let women hear. And in these steps, you also start working on the smaller things. Like in Zambia, I've realized that these meetings happen in our working hours, like that is 9 to 5 working hours. Women have to work. These meetings need to happen either in the evening or like weekend afternoon or something, which is not our working hours. So it's simple thing. Women will say, I have to drop my children to school. Like, why should I come to the meeting? So these kind of things, like that's not even like even stated. We just go as officials. So these kind of things you start coming to know in that first step when you really understand what, why, how should women even be the stakeholders for the project.
That's nice. So what I hear is that start small and informally in smaller groups. Just engage in the discussion at the beginning, and after that the women start opening up, or any kind of social group you're dealing with starts opening up. That's when you provide them the platform where they can actually make formal decision making. And at the same time, I think I really liked your point about working outside people rather than imposing what you think is the timing or the right way to go about it. Yeah, all right. So, are there any more questions from the audience?
Hi, I'm Sonali here.
Hi, Sonali.
Yeah, I'm an architect and urban designer as well. And I guess, Neha, we have interacted on LinkedIn a few months back. And not that we know each other personally, but I have a question here. Like, you when you mentioned that the dam should be worshipped or that kind of a point. So, rivers, for that matter, water for that matter, is considered to be, many religious practices are being offered. Like, you worship by the river and then you offer something, or sometimes cremation goes on, or the bodies are left down the rivers. So such things, how can we, take care of these? Because religious and that is something where somehow we fall a bit weak, wherein we want to implement the strategies, but then the sentiments of people are being hurt. So, how would you take care of that?
Uh, Again, yeah, that's a very nice question because it falls into the component of complex problem. So
Right.
I will actually give this answer based on my Bombay experience.
Okay.
Um, so before the colonizers came in, Mumbai depended on its four rivers, and the neighborhoods were highly dependent for its water source on those four rivers. The minute the Britishers gave water pipelines and the water was coming from far away source, the dependency for water decreased on the rivers and it finally went away. And then it turned into a nala, then it turned into a drainage. And that is when the other kind of practices started coming in because that was not the water that you were drinking. This is something that happens everywhere. So if I connect, so that's also where this water sensitive paradigms or all these decentralized paradigms are aiming to do is to create this kind of relationships of people to that water for everything. So if those people themselves realize that that's the water they have to drink, so that scare, that fear should come, from that water to those people. It's not us. It's I wouldn't work also on saying that, you know what, this is wrong. Again, I'm not the person. Who am I? Like that's a very colonizer's mentality to say this is right, this is wrong, this is clean, this is unclean, this is not my place. However, I will just change. So people who are doing these practices are getting water from a far away source. So if that thing stops away, and we start working on creating this space for decentralized solutions, and working on more awareness of, that water that is coming from far is it's not sustainable. You cannot rely on it, and finally you have to rely on this river in which you are doing these other activities. So can you yourself balance it out? And when they start realizing this care, oh no, I have to, like, depend on this river for my other uses, so then that solution will happen from themselves. To give you another example, sometimes like if you get diabetes and someone says, you have to stop these kind of vegetables, or stop this kind of eating too much sugar, you don't want to do it, and you think, that's, who is that person to tell me? It's not even going to affect me so soon. But then if you realize what happens, if you realize how your body reacts to certain diet, and then you do it yourself, then it's more effective also. Then you can, reduce those components. You can also do it gradually. So then that process becomes more personal, And then it's kind of something that can really happen on ground rather than doctor prescribing and telling me method to change my diet. So that is something we need to work on how do you first personalize that problem, how do you make people realize that's a problem and in their own way, and then they themselves to create a solution to transition to that solution that they have themselves created. I hope I've answered your problem. So it's not about the solution, it's more about creating the way to address the solution.
Yes, I agree. I hope that change in mindset comes like through self-realization really soon so that we can really save our rivers. Yeah, thank you for that.
So, Sonali. All right. So we still have about 4 minutes. So I would like to ask one question, Neha, to you that I have. So you talked a lot about there were a lot of things that you asked, but there was one specific thing that I kept thinking that you said decentralization will help solve a lot of problems, and I kept thinking that there are several issues with this decentralization of water management as well in India. So, I mean, during your research, have you, encountered or have you thought about
Yeah,
this idea?
very much. I think because there is problem in decentralization, that's why the centralized system gets more and more strengthened. So one thing is decentralized system is not visible. It becomes like a hobby thing. Like certain groups of people say taking care of certain water bodies, but then again, those certain groups of people can also create this kind of groupism, and that is also something that we see based on caste politics. This lake should be used by certain caste of people only. This lake is for the lower caste or for the animals. So this decentralization also creates a problem, and hence the centralized solutions came as a solution to resolve this kind of groupism and these kind of conflicts. So even for this Mumbai solution, people were only like looking at their river and their space. It wasn't, they were not looking at the sustenance of the entire water system. So this systems thinking was completely missed. To think bigger picture was completely missed. So that is also the problem. So the idea is to make decentralized system aware of this, and it's a system at the end. It's not this sporadic work. Also, the second thing is people work as on a reactive basis than a proactive basis. That's also what is happening right now in water management, community led water management. It's like my village, my lake, my water. Again, this minus is what is affecting, and that's when a larger party sweeps in and just takes over and privatizes everything. So that is, so the people make themselves vulnerable for decentralized systems to not work, and that is something that needs to be done. So there not just need to be collective participation, but also this horizontal connectivity across different communities to make this stronger approach to work against centralization. So that is something that needs to be done.
All right. That was very nice, and it reminded me of transition networks also, something that you must have been working on this aspect as well. So yeah, we are almost done with time. So thank you so much, Neha, for joining us and taking out time for this session. And yes, I think this session is formally over. And thank you so much for joining. And one last request, perhaps, if you can share your email address in the chat box so that if anybody has any questions or any if you'd like to contribute later on, so they could do that.
Yeah, just
All
share my email ID.
yes. All right. That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.